At the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly, a young African leader stood before the world and delivered words that left the room in silence. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, president of Burkina Faso, did not begin with celebration. Instead, he declared, "This 80th anniversary is more like an embarrassing fiasco, a collective disappointment, a structural failure." His voice carried the frustration of a continent that has waited decades for justice and the dignity of a people who refuse to be ignored. To understand the weight of that moment, imagine an ordinary family in the Sahel. A mother in northern Burkina Faso once fled her home when armed groups stormed her village. For years, she lived in a crowded camp, uncertain if she would ever see her land again. When she hears her president speak of sovereignty and dignity at the UN, his words are not just politics. They echo her deepest hope, that her children may return to their school, that her family may once again plant crops on the soil of their ancestors. The setting could not be more symbolic. 80 years after the creation of the UN Charter, an organization built on the promise of peace and security, an African president accused the very institution of failing the people it was meant to protect. He asked the world a piercing question: how can Africa, cradle of humanity and home to more than 1 billion people, still be excluded from the Security Council's decision-making? For older Americans watching, these words may strike a familiar chord. They recall the debates of the Cold War, when powerful nations shaped the destiny of smaller states. They also raise concerns about today's fragile order, where conflict in distant regions can ripple outward and touch even our own security. If the United Nations, after 80 years, cannot deliver fairness to Africa, then what does that mean for the future of global stability? Stay with us, because what Traoré said next would not only challenge the West, but also reveal a struggle that could redefine Africa's destiny. The hall at the United Nations was filled with dignitaries, diplomats, and presidents who had heard thousands of speeches before. Yet on this day, they listened to words that carried a different weight. President Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso did not come with flattery or carefully measured language. He came with anger and defiance, aimed directly at the heart of the international system. Standing tall at the podium, he declared that the United Nations, after 80 years, had become a disappointment. He said, "This 80th anniversary is more like an embarrassing fiasco, a collective disappointment, a structural failure." His words struck the assembly like a cold wind. Instead of praising multilateral cooperation, he reminded the world of Africa's exclusion from the decision-making table, a reality that has lasted for generations. One of his most piercing questions was simple, yet powerful. How can Africa, cradle of humanity and home to more than 1 billion people, still be excluded from the Security Council's decision-making? That question hung in the air, a reminder that while Africa bleeds and struggles, its voice is often muted when the world's most powerful nations decide its fate. To make his point, Traoré shifted from criticism to evidence. He painted a picture of Burkina Faso's fight against terrorism, a fight he claimed was not only against extremist groups, but also against the hidden interests of foreign powers. Terrorism is being used as a convenient pretext by certain states to plunder Africa's resources. These terrorists are nothing less than the armed troops of predatory foreign powers. By saying this, he pointed directly at Western nations, and most explicitly at France, accusing them of supporting or protecting the very forces that keep Burkina Faso unstable. For many watching, these were shocking words. To accuse a permanent member of the Security Council of complicity in terrorism was bold, even dangerous. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it reflected what they had long believed. In villages across the Sahel, locals whisper that foreign soldiers and companies benefit from chaos, because chaos allows resources to be taken without resistance. Traoré's speech turned those whispers into a public accusation. Behind his fiery language stood the numbers that gave his claims credibility. He told the assembly that nearly 70% of Burkina Faso's territory was once again under state control, compared to only 40% in 2022. He described how more than 700,000 displaced people had returned home and over 1,500 schools had reopened. To ordinary Burkinabe citizens, these were not just statistics. They were proof that their sacrifices and contributions mattered. To illustrate this, consider the story of a young volunteer named Amadou. When his village was attacked, he fled with nothing but the clothes on his back. Yet when the government created the Patriotic Support Fund, Amadou gave what little savings he had to support the soldiers fighting to reclaim their land. In return, he joined the ranks of volunteers defending villages with little more than old rifles and determination. When Traoré announced that this patriotic mobilization allowed us to collect about 90 billion CFA francs in 2023, Amadou's sacrifice was part of that number. For older Americans watching this story, Amadou's journey feels familiar. It recalls the generations of young men and women who gave their all during times of war and hardship, from the Great Depression to World War II. The language of duty, sacrifice, and patriotic giving is timeless. Traoré's message was clear. Burkina Faso is not asking for pity. It is demanding respect. His words carried the pride of a nation that, despite immense suffering, is trying to take control of its future. He wanted the world to know that Burkina Faso's sovereignty is non-negotiable, and that its people are ready to defend it, even at great cost. But bold words at the UN are one thing. The real question is whether these claims of progress and defiance can survive the pressures of international politics. Can a small nation, standing nearly alone, truly resist the weight of global powers? Or will the voices of its people be drowned out once more? Stay with us, because what came next revealed just how high the stakes had become. The moment of greatest tension in President Ibrahim Traoré's address came when he stopped speaking about reforms and statistics and instead issued a direct accusation. His voice grew sharper as he said, "Terrorism is being used as a convenient pretext by certain states to plunder Africa's resources. These terrorists are nothing less than the armed troops of predatory foreign powers." Then he named one nation aloud: France. In that instant, the atmosphere in the General Assembly changed. Diplomats shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Some scribbled notes, others looked at their phones, while a few delegates froze in silence. For an African leader to accuse a former colonial power, and by implication other Western states, of directly enabling terrorism was more than bold. It was a declaration of open defiance on the world stage. The climax of the speech came when Traoré dismissed a recent United Nations report on children in armed conflict. With a steady tone, he called it biased and manipulative. "We unequivocally reject the report entitled Children and Armed Conflict in Burkina Faso, peppered with counter-truths and semantic manipulation." His words carried anger, but also sadness, because to him such reports ignored the lived reality of his citizens. This was not just about policy. It was about pride and dignity. To understand what it meant to ordinary Burkinabe, picture a classroom that has just reopened after years of violence. Children sit on wooden benches, writing with borrowed pencils. Their teacher, once displaced, now smiles with relief as he calls out names on the attendance sheet. To these children and their parents, accusations that their government is the villain feel like another wound added to the scars of war. Traoré's accusations did not stop at reports or bureaucracy. He pointed at what he described as propaganda. The Macron regime's public media has become a mouthpiece for the criminals who commit cowardly and barbaric attacks against our citizens. Those words were shocking, even for seasoned observers. They revealed how deep the rift had grown between Burkina Faso and its former colonial power. International reactions varied. African delegations sympathetic to the Sahel's plight nodded quietly. Others looked uneasy, knowing the speech might provoke friction with powerful allies. Western diplomats mostly avoided immediate comment, but news agencies quickly spread the story worldwide. For many in Europe and America, Traoré's accusations sounded extreme. For others, especially in Africa, they were words of truth long suppressed. The emotional power of this moment rested not only in what Traoré said, but in what he represented. For supporters, he became the embodiment of defiance, a young soldier who dared to speak truths that older leaders had whispered, but never declared. For critics, he looked reckless, gambling his country's fragile future on inflammatory rhetoric. Among Burkinabe citizens, the response was overwhelming pride. In Ouagadougou, radio stations replayed the speech. Volunteers defending villages spoke of renewed determination. One young woman, whose husband had died fighting militants, said through tears that his sacrifice had meaning, now that their president had spoken so firmly to the world. For older Americans watching, these scenes echo past moments when leaders dared to confront superpowers, whether in the days of the Cuban Missile Crisis or during speeches at the UN by smaller nations demanding recognition. It raises a timeless question. When the powerless speak against the powerful, do they find justice, or do they face punishment? If you believe that dignity and truth should never be silenced, ask yourself, would you stand behind a leader who risks everything to protect his people, even if the world turns against him? Yet behind the pride and defiance lies a darker reality. Can these bold declarations at the UN actually protect Burkina Faso's citizens on the ground? Or will the backlash from powerful nations make life even harder for those already suffering? Stay with us, because the consequences of this speech reach far beyond applause or criticism. They could decide the fate of an entire region. When the applause faded and the echoes of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's words settled, the question remained, what do these declarations mean for the lives of ordinary citizens in Burkina Faso? His speech was not only a message to the world, but also a reflection of the daily struggles and fragile hopes of his people. Traoré pointed to the progress his government claimed at home. Nearly 70% of our territory is now under state control, compared to only 40% in 2022. More than 700,000 displaced people have returned home, and about 1,500 schools have reopened their doors. These numbers carried emotional weight. For families who had lived in tents or camps, they meant a chance to sleep again under their own roofs. For teachers, they meant hearing the sound of children reciting lessons after years of silence. Yet progress always comes with sacrifice. The Patriotic Support Fund, which Traoré praised for collecting around 90 billion CFA in 2023, was not built from wealth but from the savings of citizens, many of whom already lived in poverty. A shopkeeper in Ouagadougou contributed a week's earnings, knowing it meant less food for his own children, but believing that every coin helped protect the nation. His story reflects the reality that national sovereignty is often carried on the backs of the poorest. Politically, the consequences of Traoré's defiance are equally profound. By openly accusing France and questioning the legitimacy of the UN Security Council, Burkina Faso risks further isolation from Western donors and institutions. International aid that once flowed may be reduced. Sanctions or subtle financial pressure could follow. This creates a dangerous paradox. While Traoré's government seeks independence, may deepen economic hardship for its people in the short term. But within Burkina Faso, the political impact is different. For many, his speech was a moment of pride. After decades of feeling treated as a pawn on the global chessboard, Citizens heard their leader claim a place for them in history. His words echoed the spirit of revolutionary figures like Thomas Sankara, who once called for Africa to free itself from dependency. In villages and towns, that legacy still inspires. Some view Traoré not only as a soldier, but as a voice carrying Sankara's unfinished dream. Civil society, however, remains divided. Human rights groups worry about growing restrictions on freedoms, about journalists facing pressure, and about the risk that in defending sovereignty, the government may silence dissent. Mothers of young soldiers fear that their sons will be sacrificed in endless battles while politicians argue at the UN. Ordinary citizens live in this tension, between pride in sovereignty and fear of more suffering. For the international community, these consequences cannot be ignored. Instability in the Sahel is not confined to Burkina Faso. Violence and displacement spill across borders into Niger, Mali, and beyond. Traoré's decision to form the Confederation of Sahel States with Mali and Niger is both a political strategy and a survival mechanism. By joining forces, these nations hope to resist external pressure and build regional strength. But it also signals a deeper fracture with traditional Western partners. For older Americans watching, these dynamics may bring back memories of the 1960s and 70s, when smaller nations sought independence from Cold War superpowers and paid a heavy price. The pattern feels familiar. A leader defies the established order. Citizens rally with pride, but the backlash from larger powers threatens to undo the very progress being claimed. If you believe in justice and the right of people to live safely in their own homes, consider this. Can dignity survive when the price of independence is hunger, sacrifice, and possible isolation? Or is the willingness to endure hardship the only way a nation can truly be free? The consequences at home are clear. But what about abroad? How will the United States and its allies interpret this defiance? Will they see Traoré as a partner against extremism, or as a threat to their influence? Stay with us, because the next chapter is about how the world beyond Africa is already reacting. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré finished speaking, the message did not stay within the walls of the General Assembly. It rippled outward to Washington, Paris, Brussels, and other capitals that have long shaped the politics of Africa. His words forced the world to pay attention because they were not just a critique of the United Nations, they were a challenge to the balance of global power. In the United States, reactions were cautious. Officials acknowledged the instability of the Sahel as a growing security concern. Terrorist groups in the region are linked to networks that can threaten U.S. allies and potentially reach beyond Africa's borders. For American policymakers, the question is not whether Burkina Faso matters, but how its path will affect the broader fight against extremism. Some see Traoré's calls for sovereignty as understandable. Others worry that his alignment with Russia and his harsh stance against France could drag the region away from traditional Western cooperation. European governments, especially France, reacted more defensively. Traoré's words that these terrorists are nothing less than the armed troops of predatory foreign powers struck directly at France's reputation. French officials rejected the claim, yet the accusation resonated across Africa, where resentment against former colonial powers runs deep. In Mali and Niger, leaders echoed Burkina Faso's defiance, strengthening the newly formed Confederation of Sahel States. Beyond the West, other powers saw opportunity. Russia and China, both mentioned indirectly in Traoré's speech, have offered partnerships framed as alternatives to Western influence. For Moscow, military cooperation and security contracts in the Sahel provide both influence and resources. For Beijing, the promise of investment and infrastructure builds long-term ties. Traoré's message of sovereignty and self-determination fits neatly into their narrative of a multipolar world. For older Americans watching, the echoes of history are unmistakable. It recalls moments when the United States faced difficult choices, whether to support self-determination abroad or to prioritize alliances and strategic interests. The lesson of the Cold War lingers, reminding us that ignoring the voices of smaller nations often leads to deeper conflicts later. As Americans, we must ask ourselves, is Ibrahim Traoré a partner who can bring stability to one of the most dangerous regions in the world, or is he a rebel leader whose defiance could ignite new tensions? The answer will shape not only Africa's future, but also our own security. And so, the question grows larger. If the United Nations fails to reform, if Africa's demands remain unanswered, and if the great powers continue to clash in the Sahel, could this be the beginning of a wider crisis? Stay with us, because the story does not end with speeches. It extends into the uncertain future. As the final words of Captain Ibrahim Traoré echoed through the hall, they carried more than defiance. They carried a warning. He said clearly, "It is time for Africa to participate fully and legitimately in the UN Security Council." His message was not just a demand for representation. It was a reminder that without reform, the United Nations could face the same fate as the League of Nations, irrelevant in a time of growing danger. The stakes are high. The Sahel remains one of the most unstable regions on Earth. If progress stalls and alliances falter, the crisis could spill outward, destabilizing neighbors and fueling waves of migration, extremism, and humanitarian disaster. For the United States, this is not simply a distant problem. Instability in Africa can affect global markets, stretch security commitments, and create threats that no ocean can contain. Yet amid the warnings, there is also hope. Traoré spoke of sovereignty, of families returning home, of children back in their classrooms. Those stories remind us that even in the harshest deserts of conflict, seeds of renewal can grow. The question is whether the world will nurture them or crush them under the weight of politics. For older Americans, this moment recalls the lessons of history. Our fathers and grandfathers knew what it meant to fight for dignity, for security, and for the right to determine one's future. We are reminded that freedom often comes with sacrifice, and that the price of ignoring injustice is always higher later. If this story has touched you, let your heart speak. Ask yourself, is Ibrahim Traoré a symbol of African dignity, or a spark of new unrest? Share your thoughts, because silence has never changed history. If you believe in justice, in family, and in the right of ordinary people to defend their homes, then stand with those who still hope. And may God bless Africa, a land of strength, resilience, and unyielding will. If the African Confederation does not secure wider support in the next 3 months, Burkina Faso may find itself isolated, standing alone against external pressure. But if unity holds, this small, landlocked country could become the center of a new African awakening. The question remains, will Traoré's defiance mark the birth of a stronger Africa or the start of a deeper crisis that the world cannot contain? Only time and the choices of nations will reveal the answer.